The clock on the wood-paneled wall of my office showed exactly 9:30 in the morning when the corporate security guards escorted me out. For 22 years, I had been the invisible gear that kept Thornton Freight Systems from grinding to a halt. My name is Wade Ramirez, though most people in the freight industry simply call me Chief. I am 49 years old, a single father, and until that quiet Tuesday morning, I was the director of logistics for a $750 million shipping empire. We managed 1,800 trucks moving critical freight across the entire Midwest, making sure grain, corn, and industrial machinery arrived exactly when and where they were needed. I did not have a high-rise office with leather seats. My workspace was nestled in the noisy, concrete heart of the main terminal, smelling of diesel fumes and stale coffee. I liked it that way because I could hear the rumbling pulse of the highway and the constant chatter of the shortwave radios. The walls of my office were decorated with old logistics maps, photographs of my convoy team from my service days, and a simple wooden frame holding my military discharge papers. My dedication to logistics was forged in a much harsher environment. I spent 12 years in the United States Army, coordinating supply convoys through the dusty, dangerous roads of Afghanistan. I rose to the rank of Gunnery Sergeant E7. During my service, I lost 3 brave soldiers because a clerk at headquarters made a paperwork error that delayed our ammunition resupply. From that tragic day forward, I vowed that I would never let an administrative failure compromise a supply chain under my watch. My father had been a diesel mechanic, and he taught me that a machine is only as good as the care you put into it. I carried that lesson with me to the military and later to the docks. Civilians who play with logistics do not understand that late deliveries are not just lines on a computer screen. They represent real lives and real livelihoods. When I returned home at 33 years of age, the company founder, Wallace Thornton, hired me. Wallace was a tough man who knew the trucking business was built on relationships, respect, and timing. We had a simple agreement. I would keep his trucks rolling and he would stay out of my way. He knew that freight does not move because of a computer program. It moves because people trust each other. For 2 decades, that agreement worked flawlessly. Then, Wallace decided to retire to his ranch, handing the keys of the business to his son, Preston Thornton. Preston was a 32-year-old manager who possessed an expensive business degree but had never gotten grease under his fingernails. He arrived with bright white teeth, tailored suits, and a desperate desire to disrupt the trucking industry. Within his first month, Preston had replaced our traditional driver break room with a meditation chamber and hired Chloe Bennett, his girlfriend, as the chief culture officer. Chloe was a 26-year-old coordinator who spoke exclusively in corporate buzzwords and had never stepped foot on a loading dock. Preston looked at me and saw an old veteran who was obsolete. He believed that the future belonged entirely to algorithms and automated scheduling, and that men who worked with their hands were merely a temporary necessity. I looked at him and saw a second lieutenant fresh out of the academy, possessing plenty of authority but absolutely zero field experience. He thought that 22 years of experience could be replaced by a modern scheduling platform. The friction grew slowly, like a hidden leak in a pneumatic line. Preston wanted us to communicate through digital messaging apps and automated portals, while I preferred speaking directly to the dispatchers and drivers. When a trucker is caught in a blizzard, they do not want to receive a digital icon or a pre-written text. They need to hear a human voice telling them where to find shelter. I kept my head down and focused on the harvest season, which was our busiest time of the year. Hundreds of farmers across Iowa and Illinois were counting on our 1,800 trucks to move their corn and soybeans before the first winter frost ruined their crops. My own son, Oscar Ramirez, who was 19 years old and training to be a welder at a trade school, was counting on my position staying secure to pay his tuition. Oscar was my pride, a hard-working young man who knew the value of working with his hands. I worked 14-hour days, coordinating schedules and managing routes to ensure not a single load of grain was lost. Then came the email that ruined everything. Preston announced a mandatory weekend team-building excellence retreat at a luxury resort. All directors and supervisors were ordered to attend trust-building seminars. I looked at the schedule and realized the retreat fell on the exact weekend we were moving 40 temperature-sensitive grain shipments. I replied politely, stating that I could not attend because our agricultural customers were running critical loads. I explained that a single delay could ruin a farmer's entire harvest. I thought my explanation was reasonable. I was wrong. The following Monday, the terminal felt strangely quiet. The drivers avoided my gaze, and when I tried to log into my terminal, my screen displayed an access denied notification. I was about to call the technician when Preston walked in, flanked by Chloe and two security guards. "We are implementing a digital transformation initiative," Preston said, checking his luxury watch twice as he spoke. "Your unwillingness to align with our team culture makes you a poor fit for our future direction." He said it with a slick, rehearsed smile. I sat in my creaking office chair, holding a lukewarm cup of black coffee. Chloe stood beside him, clutching a digital tablet and nodding in agreement. "You need to understand that we need team members who vibrate on a higher frequency," Chloe added, her voice dripping with meaningless corporate terminology. Preston then delivered the phrase that cut through 22 years of loyalty. He told me they were paying a director's salary to a man who essentially spent his day playing a children's game of block, stacking with container trucks. He claimed that our manual processes were holding the business back and that an automated system could do my job in a fraction of the time. I looked at Preston, then at Chloe, and finally at the security guards. I did not yell, I did not argue, and I did not plead for my job. I stood up slowly and pulled my worn logbook from my pocket. It was a black notebook filled with shorthand notes, private phone numbers, tide schedules, and crane codes that only I could decipher. I slid the book into my jacket pocket, took off my security badge, and dropped it onto the glass desk, where it landed with a sharp, metallic click. I told Preston that my relationships with 800 suppliers, the local transport unions, and the Regional Agricultural Alliance did not exist in his digital cloud database. I warned him that by 14:30 that very afternoon, his entire network would realize the nerve center of the company had been severed. Preston laughed, calling me arrogant, and told me that everyone was replaceable in modern business. He ordered the guards to escort me to the gate, convinced his software would handle the workload. The security guards, two older guys who had worked the gate for a decade, looked down in embarrassment. They apologized quietly as we walked, telling me they were just following orders. I told them not to worry about it, that they had a job to do, and I respected that. We had shared many early morning coffees at the gate, and they knew I was a man of my word. I walked out to the parking lot, feeling the heavy, humid air of the docks settle over my shoulders. The sun was hot against the asphalt, and in the distance, I could hear the deep rumble of diesel engines and the clanging of container locks. I climbed into my heavy-duty pickup truck, which was manufactured in 2018, tossed my safety vest onto the passenger seat, and sat in silence for a few minutes. I was 49 years old, and for the first time in 22 years, I did not have an office. I sat in the cab of my pickup truck, the engine idling as the air conditioning tried to fight the stifling heat. I looked at the terminal gate, watching a cargo truck pull up. The driver looked confused, gesturing to the gate camera. The automated scanner was failing to read his barcode, and there was nobody in the office to manually override the system. It was the first sign of the collapse, a small crack in the dam that would soon burst. The anxiety about my mortgage, health insurance, and Oscar trade school tuition started to creep in, but my military training quickly took over. I was a veteran who had survived convoy operations in hostile territory. I knew how to analyze a situation, identify vulnerabilities, and execute a tactical response. I pulled out my personal mobile phone. I had never mixed my personal contacts with my corporate account, meaning my private list of logistics contacts was mine alone. I sat in my truck and began typing a short message to my entire network. I informed them that effective immediately, Wade Ramirez was no longer employed by Thornton Freight Systems. I explained that I was no longer authorized to sign off on safety certifications, rate negotiations, or cargo safety protocols. I specifically reminded them to refer to Clause 7B of our standard transport contracts. Years ago, when Thornton was expanding rapidly and vendor companies were nervous about getting paid, I had negotiated a clause stating that any change in key relationship personnel would trigger an automatic credit and safety review, allowing the vendors to pause service until they vetted my replacement. Preston had never read those contracts. He probably assumed they were just standard legal templates. I spent 30 minutes sending the message to every supplier, port director, and transport dispatcher in my phone book. It was like pulling the pins from dozens of financial grenades. My phone buzzed almost immediately with a call from Otis Miller, the head of the local transport union. Otis was a gruff man who had worked the docks for 30 years. He asked me what was happening, noting that my work email was returning a delivery failure message. I explained that I had been terminated for a culture fit issue because I chose to coordinate the weekend grain harvest instead of attending Preston corporate retreat. Otis laughed loudly, stating that the college boy had no idea what he was doing. He told me that his 200 drivers would not move a single truck without my safety authorization. I reminded him of Clause 7B, and he told me the trucks were parking immediately. I started my truck and drove to a local highway diner to establish my command post. The highway diner was quiet, smelling of grease and fresh coffee. Outside, a gentle rain began to tap against the windows, and the neon sign flickered through the gray afternoon light. The diner was a classic roadside stop, with wood paneling and yellowed posters of old trucks on the walls. I sat in a sticky vinyl booth in the corner, where the waitress, Brenda, who had known me for 15 years, brought me a fresh cup of coffee and a warm slice of apple pie. She told me I looked like I was planning a battle, and I smiled, telling her she was not far from the truth. The diner was a sanctuary, a quiet bubble of comfort, while the logistics empire outside was beginning to tear itself apart. I set up my laptop on the worn table and logged into a public tracking portal that monitored freight movements. Within an hour, small red indicators began appearing across the digital map of the Midwest. Red meant a cargo vehicle had been stationary for more than 30 minutes. A massive cluster of red indicators was forming just outside the main Chicago terminal gate. The security codes for the entry gates updated automatically every Tuesday morning, and the system required a manual override from my terminal to distribute the new codes to the incoming drivers. I had not performed the override before being escorted out. Preston probably assumed the gates opened by magic or by the sheer prestige of his university degree. My phone began ringing constantly. Dispatchers, terminal managers, and independent drivers were calling to report that the entire network was locking down. The chaos was spreading quickly through the logistics corridor. At 12:30, I received a call from Chloe. She was hyperventilating, demanding that I give her the gate access codes. In the background, I could hear a cacophony of ringing phones, shouting staff, and computer alarms. I answered calmly, stating that since my employment had been terminated, my security clearance was revoked. I explained that sharing corporate credentials with unauthorized individuals was a violation of federal cybersecurity laws, and that I could face prosecution. Chloe pleaded, saying she was only doing her job, but I reminded her that corporate buzzwords could not coordinate physical trucks. Preston grabbed the phone, his voice shaking with anger, and threatened to sue me for corporate sabotage if I did not help them. I told him that since he had declared everyone was replaceable, his agile leadership team should have no trouble recovering the passwords. I suggested he contact the emergency support line for their software provider, which cost $5,000 an hour, and usually took 24 hours to respond. Preston screamed that they had 300 tons of harvest soybeans sitting in trucks, and that the crop would spoil if it remained idle in the heat. I explained that soybeans were indeed a delicate commodity, and asked if he had remembered to renew the climate control contracts for the storage facilities, which required manual renewal every month. I heard a loud thud, as if he had slammed his fist on his desk before I hung up. The satisfaction of that moment was immense. My next call was from Pete Fletcher, the cold storage warehouse foreman. He told me he had heard the news and wanted to know if he should hook the incoming trucks to their backup power grid. We had frozen pork and dairy products that would spoil within hours. Pete told me that 3 other drivers from Iowa were already parking their rigs in his yard, refusing to deliver their grain to Thornton. They had heard about my firing through the driver grapevine and were standing in solidarity with me. I felt a deep warmth in my chest. In this industry, loyalty is not something you can buy with a corporate bonus. It is earned through years of mutual respect. I instructed him to use our emergency contingency account to keep the refrigeration running so the drivers did not lose their fuel, but to ensure no trucks left the yard. The drivers trusted me because I had spent 22 years keeping my word and looking after their safety. My real currency was respect, not a corporate title. I realized that I was no longer an employee. I was a logistics coordinator with a loyal network that followed me, not the company name. I decided to contact Reginald Gentry, the vice president of Apex Logistics. Apex was Thornton's largest rival, and Reginald had tried to recruit me for 6 consecutive years. I had always declined out of loyalty to Wallace, but that loyalty had been destroyed by his son. I dialed Reginald's number, and he answered immediately. When I told him I was available, there was a long pause on the line. He asked where I was, and I told him I was at the Highway Diner on Route 88. Reginald told me to stay put, and that he was sending a vehicle to pick me up. I told him that I was not coming alone. I was bringing my entire network of dispatchers, transport unions, and agricultural clients. He laughed and told me he would send his finest vehicle. While waiting, I watched the digital map. More red indicators appeared, showing that the freight empire was freezing solid. The dispatchers and drivers were showing their loyalty to me, proving that human trust is the true engine of logistics. A luxury black vehicle pulled up to the diner 30 minutes later, looking completely out of place among the heavy transport trucks. I gathered my laptop and climbed inside. The soft leather seats and the smell of expensive air freshener were a stark contrast to my work boots, and the driver drove in silence as we headed toward the downtown headquarters of Apex Logistics. I looked out the window at the familiar warehouse districts, the loading bays, and the container terminals that I had managed for over 2 decades. Everything looked different from the back seat of a town car. As we drove, the city streets seemed to blur past the tinted windows. I watched the cargo ships anchored in the bay, waiting for their turn to unload. Some of those ships were carrying cargo that had been routed by my team just days before. Now, they were floating in limbo, victims of Preston digital revolution. The driver turned onto the highway, navigating the traffic with professional ease, and soon the massive Apex Tower came into view. I checked the transport news websites on my phone. The industry portals were already reporting major service disruptions at Thornton Freight Systems. A headline on a prominent logistics website asked who Wade Ramirez was and why the drivers refused to roll without him. Then a breaking news alert appeared on my screen that made my heart heavy. A Thornton freight vehicle had been involved in a multi-truck collision on Interstate 80, resulting in a serious hazardous materials spill. I immediately called Otis Miller to get the details. Otis told me that Preston had hired an independent, non-union driver through a temporary smartphone app to move a critical cargo load of industrial chemicals. The young driver, who was only 21 years old, did not possess the required hazardous materials certification and had taken a wet curve too quickly, causing the vehicle to jackknife and spill chemicals across the highway. The driver was in the hospital, and the Environmental Protection Agency had shut down the interstate. Otis told me that the Department of Transportation was preparing to issue a mandatory safety audit which would ground the entire Thornton fleet. My anger was deep. This was no longer a simple corporate dispute. Preston arrogance had put lives in danger and caused an environmental disaster because he refused to admit he needed experienced personnel to run a complex logistics operation. We arrived at the Apex headquarters, a modern tower of glass and steel that rose 40 stories into the gray sky. The lobby was vast, with polished marble floors, security turnstiles, and a receptionist who greeted me by name. It was clear that Reginald had prepared his staff for my arrival. Reginald Gentry was waiting for me in the lobby, extending his hand with a serious expression. He told me that Thornton's stock was plummeting and that they were facing federal investigation. We went up to his office on the 35th floor, which overlooked the city. The high-speed elevator made my ears pop, and through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the container cranes moving at the rival harbor. Reginald offered me a position as the Vice President of Strategic Agricultural Operations, offering a salary that exceeded my previous pay by 20%. I told him that I did not want a standard corporate job. I wanted full autonomy to run the new division my way, reporting only to him, and bringing my entire network of union drivers and agricultural dispatchers. I insisted that our drivers' pension contributions be fully guaranteed under the new contracts. Reginald smiled and agreed to my terms, writing them down himself. He knew that the major clients of Thornton would be looking for a safe port, and I was the only coordinator who could provide it. While we were waiting for the legal contracts to be prepared, my phone rang. It was Oliver Barnes, the longtime attorney for the Thornton family. He told me that Wallace Thornton plane had just landed from Arizona. Wallace was furious about the cargo freeze and the environmental disaster, but he did not yet know the full extent of the damage. Oliver told me that Wallace was heading to the terminal to confront his son. I thanked Oliver for the information, signed the contract with Apex, and went to meet my old boss. I drove my pickup truck to the private airfield, parking near the hangar just as Wallace was stepping off his private jet. He was shouting into his phone, his face red with anger, looking exhausted and old. When he saw my truck, he walked over and accused me of destroying the company he had spent his life building. I told him to get in the truck and that I would explain the situation. The private aviation area was quiet, and the wind blew dust across the concrete runway. The wind on the runway was cold, carrying the sharp smell of jet fuel and ozone. I stood by the wing of my truck, watching the ground crew secure Wallace' jet. He descended the metal steps slowly, his shoulders slumped as if he were carrying the weight of the entire company. The anger in his eyes was mixed with a deep, exhausting sadness. He had built this company from a single truck, and now he was watching it die. Wallace was breathing heavily, his hands trembling as he gripped the door handle of my truck. He looked out at the runway, where the rain was starting to pool on the concrete. The noise of the private jet engines was a high-pitched whine that slowly faded as they shut down. Wallace climbed in, slammed the door, and looked at me with eyes full of fury and confusion. Wallace climbed into the passenger seat, slamming the door, and demanded to know why his life work was in ruins. I told him that I did not destroy his company. I simply stopped holding the pieces together when his son fired me. We drove slowly down the industrial highway, the wipers clearing the rain from the windshield with a rhythmic squeaking sound. On both sides of the road, the backup was visible. The blue and white Thornton transport vehicles sat idle on the shoulder, their hazard lights blinking in unison. The drivers, men I had worked with for 20 years, were gathered in small groups under the overhangs of the warehouses, talking quietly. They looked like soldiers who had been abandoned by their general. Wallace stared at them, his eyes filled with regret. He recognized many of them by name, and he knew that their families depended on the company's survival. The drive with Wallace was the longest 5 miles of my life. He did not say a word, just stared out the passenger window at the silent terminal. The trucks were parked in long, neat rows, their engines off, and their drivers gone. It looked like a graveyard of steel. Wallace sighed, a sound that seemed to come from the very bottom of his soul. He had spent his entire life working to build this brand, and it had taken his son only a few weeks to destroy it. I explained how Preston had terminated my employment over a weekend retreat, and how his temporary driver had caused the hazardous materials spill. I told Wallace that the Environmental Protection Agency fines would exhaust their financial reserves, and that the federal safety audit would ground their entire fleet, making the company worthless within a week. Wallace looked out the window, his expression growing tired. He asked if I would return if he fired Preston and cleaned out the entire management team. I told Wallace that too much damage had been done and that I had already signed a contract with Apex Logistics. However, I offered him a way to protect the 400 drivers and their $20 million pension fund, which would otherwise be consumed by legal fees and environmental fines. I proposed that Apex would assume all of Thornton liabilities and guarantee the pension fund in exchange for purchasing the remaining assets of Thornton Freight Systems for exactly $1. It was a harsh offer, but it was the only way to ensure the workers did not lose their retirement. Wallace sat in silence for a long time, the weight of his 72 years visible on his face. Finally, he nodded slowly and agreed to the deal, asking me to save the pensions. He knew that his company was dead, but his workers could still be saved. The transition to Apex Logistics was a massive undertaking, but we executed it with military precision. Over the next 3 weeks, I worked 16-hour days, coordinating the transfer of client accounts, rerouting shipments, and ensuring the union drivers were integrated into the Apex system without a single day of lost work. My new office at Apex was spacious and bright, with a large desk and a panoramic view of the shipping channels. I could watch the container ships gliding through the water, their engines humming as they moved cargo across the globe. It was a new chapter, but the principles remained the same. Work hard, keep your word, and respect the people who do the heavy lifting. All 400 union drivers had kept their pensions and transitioned to Apex. Otis Miller had sent me a commemorative plaque that read, "We roll when you say roll," which I hung proudly next to my military decorations. Preston had been sentenced to 18 months in a federal correction facility for safety violations and financial misconduct, while Chloe's podcast about corporate culture had been canceled after 3 episodes. Wallace remained in Arizona, and he had recently sent me a case of high-quality cigars with a note thanking me for protecting his workers. My son, Oscar, had completed his welding certification and had already received 3 job offers, making me a proud father. We sat at the dining table last night, celebrating his success. My new assistant, Giles, walked in with the daily operations report, showing that our fleet utilization was up by 23% with 0 safety incidents. I looked at the reports, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. I had not sought revenge out of anger. I did it because competence must sometimes remind privilege who actually keeps the world running. The managers in their expensive suits often forget that a business is built on the sweat and trust of the working people, and when that trust is broken, their digital systems collapse like a house of cards. Giles told me we had a logistics emergency in Nebraska due to an early frost warning and needed 150 trucks by dawn. The local farming cooperatives were desperate, as their entire year of hard labor was at stake. I looked at the digital map display, called Otis to coordinate the driver schedules, and prepared to work through the night. I put on my headset and opened the route mapping software, ready to move the freight. We would work through the night to ensure every crop was saved, because that is what real logistics professionals do. In the end, it is not about the corporate titles or the flashy software. It is about the real work that keeps the country moving forward.